Thank you all for joining us today for the Corporate Customer Training, Cybersecurity, and Account Takeover course. I'd like to turn today's presentation over to Katie Kane.
Thank you, Kim. So today we are going to dive into the topic of cybersecurity and account takeover. So why is cybersecurity so important? For every member of an organization, you play a huge role in protecting your organization. So that's pretty much why cybersecurity is so important. And we're going to go ahead and talk through some things related to cybersecurity and account takeover. But for right now, this is just our little disclaimer as a reminder that everything we do say today is generalized. So if you do have any specific questions about your own environment, we recommend that you reach out to us directly or to your IT provider or IT team, or even someone else that you trust to talk to about your specific environment needs. So the topics that we're going to cover today include corporate account takeover and how it happens, how the threat landscape has changed since we're doing so much business in the cyber world more and more today, and common security concerns surrounding phishing, patching, malware, user administration, etc. And then also some tips for maintaining a good cybersecurity mindset and some baseline controls and practices that you could apply. So what is CATO? The big question. Corporate account takeover, also known as CATO, is account takeover, which I like to just call ATO, specifically targets business owners or business-owned user credentials. It occurs when an attacker discovers how to obtain unauthorized access to a legitimate employee account, which is then used for fraudulent purposes. And this can be done in many ways, but some examples are noted here on the screen. So theft of login credentials. This can be through gaining access to them from hacking a system, or even purchasing them over the dark web as a result of a data compromise. Brute force credential cracking is a hacking method that uses trial and error to crack passwords, login credentials, and encryption keys. Phishing, this is one that we're all very familiar with. I say it all the time, think before you click, because it's easy for a bad guy to steal our information through a phishing attack. Theft through malware, and this is done by installing maybe keylogger software or other monitoring tools, or it could even be through a malware attack that reroutes a legitimate site to a fake site, and you enter your credentials into the fraudulent site, which then of course they get to obtain your credentials. And then another one that we like to talk about is man in the middle. And this is where the fraudster is sitting on your computer watching your every move, which includes you entering your information. Obviously, that's how they gain access to it. Corporate account takeover is a type of corporate identity theft that often results in a loss of funds. Attackers are going beyond just accessing business financial information. There's been a massive escalation over the past few years where initiating wires and simple account takeover is no longer the most significant issue. Hackers have started going after non-public market information, intellectual property, even manipulating log files. According to security.org, during the period of 2017 through 2021, the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center recorded a total of 2.76 million cyber attack complaints, an average of about 690,000 per year. And they receive a report of approximately every 45.7 seconds is what it had reported. More concerning information is the number of losses reported. So of the 2.76 million complaints lost, a total of $18.7 billion, which is an average loss of about 6,700 per individual. That's massive. What they're doing is gaining access to customer finances and data through compromised login credentials. From there, they process unauthorized transactions or funds transfers, and they also create new fake online banking user accounts, which is more relevant to a business account owner. And then they steal customer information, whether that be account information, social security information, or details about the person, you name it. They tend to use that information in future fraudulent attacks. There are many reasons that this could happen. One, a lack of security. This could be lack of multi-factor authentication or even reusing passwords across multiple systems. a phishing attack that leads to the installation of malware or even capturing of credentials. Credential stuffing, which is another way that they can gain access. So, of course, I'm sure you're asking what that is. By definition, credential stuffing is the automated injection of stolen username and password pairs or credentials into the website login forms in order to fraudulently gain access to user accounts. So like I said a second ago, users will likely reuse the same password or username and email, which is not a good practice. And we will discuss that a little bit later. But when those credentials are exposed by maybe a data breach or phishing attack or something of that nature, submitting those sets of stolen credentials into dozens or hundreds of other sites can allow an attacker to compromise those accounts too. And a little bit later, I'll tell you about a situation that actually happened to me recently. So I know it happens, and no matter how much security you have in place. But number 4 here is email compromise is also another way that they can gain access. And we've seen an influx in auto forwarding being enabled, which sends the emails to an address configured, to the address configured by the fraudster. And this is one area that we tell most clients to pay close attention to and see if there's a way within your organization to restrict this type of forwarding or even monitor for it. So let's break each of these down a little further. Think about this. Your computer gets compromised and you have your computer set to stay logged into your internet banking account. Well, if there's a bad guy on your computer, they would also have full access to your internet banking account and could process a transaction without you knowing. And this is why it's important to set inactivity timeouts to protect the end user and to train users to log out when they're finished with their session. When your browser or password manager automatically fills in passwords, you have the ability to see the username and password displayed on the page. And this is a major security risk, as a malicious script embedded in the web page might be able to see the information as well. Another risk is sending a code to text or email that is on the same device that you are accessing your account. Although this is a very convenient feature, you do give the bad guy a view of this information as well, which puts you at risk of getting compromised. So phishing and malware can lead to exploited devices, which in turn would allow unauthorized access. And also this could lead to your sensitive information being compromised. We discussed credential stuffing a little bit earlier, and we know that we have all become a victim of having our password compromised through some sort of breach. So when that happens, we need to ensure that we change them as soon as possible, especially if we're using the same password for access to several different systems. All systems should have a unique password to access, which helps to prevent this type of risk from happening. So if you did have one system compromised, it's not good to just change that one system. It's likely that the bad guys are going to hit another system later. Email compromise is one of the most financially damaging online crimes out there. It exploits the fact that so many of us rely on email to conduct business, both personally and professionally. And here's where I was going to talk about my situation. So recently I experienced a major compromise where many of my accounts were compromised kind of at the same time, but I believe that it might have started with one of my personal email accounts. So it led me to, this whole situation led me to having a compromise of my Lowe's account along with someone trying to buy cars in my name, which was pretty scary. They were pretty expensive cars, mind you. Everything that we do is tied to our email, which is something that it reminds me of regularly. In an email scam, criminals send an email message that appears to come from a known source making a legitimate request, like in the examples I'm about to discuss. So one could be a vendor or company, a vendor that your company regularly deals with, sends an invoice with an updated mailing address. Seems harmless, but it might be something you may want to double check, call them and verify before you go make that change. A company CEO asks his or her assistant to purchase gift cards to send out as an employee reward. After the purchase is complete, the CEO then asks for the serial number so he or she can email them out right away. A home buyer might receive a message from his title company with instructions on how to wire his down payment. Big concerning situation. Might need to pick up the phone and call to verify that. Versions of these scenarios happen to real victims. I was obviously a victim of this recently. all of the messages were fake in these instances. And in each case, thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars were sent to criminals instead. Thankfully, in my case, I have alerts set up on all of my accounts. So I was able to stop the Lowe's purchase in its tracks, and the car purchases, I was able to contact the dealerships to put a stop to those as well. So thank goodness for alerting systems. I would definitely recommend that to everyone. So at this point, you may be feeling a little overwhelmed, as many of us do when it comes to this kind of situation. I personally wish the fraudsters would just use their powers for good instead of bad, because it would help us all out. But now let's go ahead and shift gears a little bit and talk about the threat landscape and what we have been seeing in the industry as it relates to data breaches. In March of this year, ChatGPT suffered a data breach that exposed the personal and financial information of around 1.2% of their ChatGPT Plus subscribers. The organization Bleeping Computer reported that the data breach led to an outage and allowed ChatGPT users to view other users' personal information and chat queries. This was due to a bug that was identified in their open source library. And it was noted that as soon as it was discovered, OpenAI reached out to the maintainers of the system with a patch to resolve the issue. Activision is a video game maker. They confirmed that they suffered a data breach in early December of 2022 after hackers had gained access to their internal systems by tricking an employee through a text phishing attack. It was noted that the hack did not expose game source code or player details, but sensitive workplace documents were exfiltrated during the breach, along with content release information all the way through November of 2023. The employee who was compromised was also, this is kind of funny, a member of the HR department. That department probably should take some precautions because they do tend to have access to a lot of sensitive email or employee information. And this individual who was compromised actually had access to sensitive employee details. So they had to do a little bit more research to see what was compromised in that respect. Twitter, so now this is one that we've all heard about and know about. Data of over 200 million Twitter users was leaked, and Twitter released an update regarding this breach and noted that they previously informed users in August of 2022 and January of 2022 that they had received notice from their bug bounty program of a vulnerability in Twitter's system. If someone had submitted an email address or phone number to Twitter's system, the system would tell this person what Twitter account these submitted email addresses or phone numbers were associated with, if any. And it was a result of an update in code that was applied in June of 2021. And once they learned of the vulnerability, they investigated and corrected it. But then again, in July of 2022, they learned that someone had possibly leveraged the information from 2021 and was trying to sell the information that they had compromised. So in November of 2022, they identified through comparison of the data reported during the July 2022 incident that the exposed data was the same in both cases. So in December of 2022, they received additional information indicating that someone was reporting that they had access to over 400 million Twitter emails and phone numbers. And in January of 2023, I know there's lots of dates in this one, but in January of 2023, there was a similar situation where someone was attempting to sell data from over 200 million Twitter user accounts. And some of the information included in this breach of information included both private phone numbers and email addresses, usernames, screen names, following counts, account creation dates, as well as public data. It might also be feasible to identify anonymous Twitter users using this leak and reveal their true identities, which can put at risk many journalists, activists, and similar users around the world. Pretty big situation. Dropbox, on November 1st of 2022, Dropbox confirmed that they were the victim of a data breach. The bad guy had gained access to one of the developers' accounts after he or she had fell victim to a phishing attack. And the bad guy gained access to credentials, data, and other secrets within the code repositories. Dropbox did disclose that certain plain text secrets, such as API keys and other credentials, were also included in the code that was compromised. And it was also noted that a few thousand names and email addresses belonging to Dropbox employees were also exposed. So I definitely read up on this one if you are a Dropbox user, because this one was very concerning to me. What have we learned thus far? So discovery is obviously often a challenge, which is why we have to react timely. According to UpGuard, in 2022, the average time to identify a breach was 207 days, which is a drop from the previously reported 212 days in 2021. Not a very large drop, but it is a drop. And the average time to contain was 70 days, which also is less than the previously reported 75 days from 2021. So it appears that we're getting a little bit better in this area, but as you can see, this is still a pretty long time frame for a bad guy to go undetected. The average time to identify and contain ransomware and destructive attacks were noted as 237 days and 233 days, respectively. So just some statistics for you to know, just so you know how hard it is to detect these types of threats. So another thing that we need to think about when it comes to breaches is reputation risk. I always stress this every time I do give this class. Our reputation is really important to us. So what would happen when your customers or clients find out it was you that caused the issue? Maybe you didn't apply security patches, maybe you didn't train your employees, whatever the reason may be, you were the cause of the issue. Some of the reason that the data breaches are so prevalent is because we do so much of our business online. It's pretty much unavoidable. But we do need to be a little bit more educated with what we're doing, and just, you know, the convenience factor is great. We need to take precautions. Okay, so while in-person tactics and phone calls are still threats, we're going to focus on what's happening in the cybersecurity realm. So the main culprit that gets hackers into your systems is through phishing attacks. I mean, that's something that happens on a daily basis. And it's defined as being the fraudulent practice of sending emails purporting to be from reputable companies in order to convince individuals to reveal personal information, such as passwords and credit card numbers. Anyone with an email address can be a target, obviously. It can get worse when email addresses are posted in areas on your website. Not only can this information include internal employees, but could include outsourced vendors, accountants, HR, payroll, IT, you name it. No one's immune to these attacks, so it's important to recognize them for what they are. There are some instances where you become the target of an attack. They gain access to your vendors, your payroll company, your IT staff, your HR department, all these individuals that you do business with. They then gain access to their email addresses, and then it just kind of spreads like wildfire. So we definitely need to pay attention to that. Phishing is completed though through email, and there are many different things that can happen from interacting with that email. So installation of malware, we kind of talked about this a little bit before. Installation of malware can occur. Credentials can be stolen through redirection to fake or spoofed websites. Information related to your computer or network can be sent back to the hacker. A certain task can be executed on your specific machine or across your network. And this can happen in a variety of different ways. According to Phishing Box LLC, the phishing failure rates per industry are still up there. Education coming in top with close to 5% failure rate, excuse me. Although this doesn't seem too large of a percentage, 5% of say 5,000 people would be a total of 250 individuals. That is a large number of individuals to fail a phishing campaign. And 5,000 is a very, very low number, because this is 5% of like probably millions at this point. So that means that credentials in this example that I was giving, the 5,000 people, credentials of 250 employees were likely compromised in an attack. All it takes is one individual in order to gain access, as we have witnessed in the breaches that were noted earlier. Several of those were related to someone failing a phishing test or a phishing attack and falling victim. One individual created a huge compromise. So we all need to be more diligent when looking at emails, and we need to think before we click on anything. Same goes for smishing, the social SMS text phishing. That's getting to be more prevalent as well. So let's go over a few different examples of the different types of phishing attacks that we have seen or experienced internally here. Although this is an example from years ago, it is still relevant as this happens daily. And the sad thing is that the bad guys are getting even more clever, so it's getting harder to spot them. HR requests are a great example here. And this is something that happens often. A bad actor will try to pose as you to your HR department to attempt to make a change to your direct deposit. So a good way to see that this is a fake request is that it might not be the right email address. In this instance, it's box@itservermailbox.net. It's definitely not, Katie Kane or kkane@capeandkrause.com. Obviously, that's a big key giveaway. It could also a lot of times mean that it's not necessarily the tone that the employee would write an email in, because you're used to talking to them on a regular basis in the email. It's not normally their normal format. A lot of times you can also hover over the address to see that it may be incorrect. It could look very similar. Maybe the fraudsters took the I's and made them ones to make it look very legitimate, but you could literally mouse over it and see where it was pointing to. Definitely don't click on it, just hover over it. And we all need to have procedures to handle these types of requests. I sure hope that no one here would just take this request as is and process it from there without confirming with the employee. Another good example is vendor payments or invoices. What they are trying to do here is make this an urgent request, but also making themselves unavailable for a phone call. So what happens here is that the user then takes this information and processes the request, resulting in funds being sent to the bad actor and not a legitimate vendor. So a really good control for organizations to use to help identify these emails is the external email banner that is at the top of all externally received messages. This makes it really easy to see when something isn't coming from an internal address. This could be that it's in here, Susan Fry at your company. She's your accounts payable department leader, and she sends you, the clerk, some type of request saying, I'm not here, or I need you to do this ASAP and handle in my absence, whatever it may be. Those external email banners would actually be very helpful because you can see that it's not coming from inside your actual domain. Another giveaway is the sense of urgency behind the email. Always call and confirm. It's better to interrupt a meeting than to process this type of request and lose tons of money. Unusual login activity is another good example of the type of phishing attacks that we've seen. In this instance, it talks about unusual activity on your account. Of course, they included a little blurb about if this was you, then you can ignore, but we all know that it is going to look like it's not your login. So they hope in that case that you will click the link to check on the account. And if you've ever experienced this type of phishing attack, you never want to click the link. Go directly to your login the way that you typically do, whether that's by typing it in the browser window manually, or maybe even using a bookmark that you've saved. From there, you can check your login activity. I get these often from Netflix or whatever. You go log in directly to Netflix and bam, there's nothing showing inactive or unusual activity. This is just a ploy for them to try to get you to click. This example looks pretty similar to the password reset for Microsoft. The bad actors are really making it harder, like I said before, for us to identify when these requests are real or they're not. You have to use your gut instinct, and if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. For this one, you would know if you requested to reset your password. If you didn't request it, then definitely don't enter your credentials. When in doubt, delete the message and contact your IT department for that type of request. They can help reset your password at that time. We all get emails like this. We already saw that Dropbox had a big compromise also, but it's important to be skeptical and really question whether or not that person would be sending you any files in this manner, or if it's out of the ordinary. So clicking the link could allow a login to Dropbox to steal the password, or installation of malware could occur. One thing that you should do for emails like this is to call the person that it appears to be from and validate the legitimacy that's behind the email. That way you can ensure that it is in fact from that individual. I get calls like that all the time because I might have sent a share file message to a client directly to them. They called me asking if it was legitimate. I confirm, they open, or I deny and say, no, that was not me. Definitely delete that message. So something you should do is definitely confirm with the individual. So let's talk about what you can do from here. You can definitely inspect for typos, although this is getting harder and harder to spot. Obviously, things like ChatGPT is a great example that it can go ahead and type up some stuff for you, and it's pretty much, it is accurate the way that it's typing it with punctuation and everything. So it's getting very hard for us to identify those things. Check the email address, like I said, see if the domain if it's a correct domain to ensure it's actually legitimate. Hover over the links to see where they're actually pointing to. Hover, don't click. I know ours, if you actually click, like highlighted over or hovered over one of the links in our phishing tests that we send out, although they're not harmful, people can see that it's going to an IP address, not what it actually says on the screen. Right click and copy and paste into the address bar. But doing this is also a little risky, as the website could still look legitimate but be misspelled and point you to a malicious site. So make sure you pay close attention to these links. This would be my least secure method to tell you to use. Probably avoid that one, but you could do that. And lastly, visit the site manually. This is probably the best case if you recognize the website or you have an account with Amazon, say. Just visit Amazon.com and then locate the page manually. This will ensure that you are not falling victim to the bad actor. That's probably my biggest one. Go directly to the website yourself, type it in, and log in the normal way that you normally would. As with any threat, it doesn't, if it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. So don't click it, delete it, and report it. Another way to potentially detect a fraudulent email is paying attention to the sender's tone. If it's different from how they would normally speak or write, it could be an issue. So definitely look at the tone. When an email appears urgent or threatening in nature, they are usually fake. Be leery of responding to those. Again, do not comply with the request, delete and report it. We see this a lot with wire transfer requests coming in, and it says it's from the CEO. They're in a meeting and they can't talk right now, but this is urgent. They need to send this payment off, blah, blah, blah. Interrupt their meeting. That's what I would recommend. Or sit there and wait. And it's better to get your hand slapped as opposed to getting fired from losing, $100,000 in a wire that was sent out. Anything that's unfamiliar or unexpected, make sure that you scrutinize those closely. This is one of the instances I just discussed where it might be best to reach out to the individual sending the message to confirm the validity. Obviously, this is only the case where you know the other party, if you can contact because you have a relationship with them. If you're not sure who they are or you weren't expecting it, delete it. If they need you, they're going to call you. At the end of the day, though, all it takes is one click to infect a network or to gather credentials and cause a major data breach. Hackers are growing increasingly aware of tactics that they can use to bypass software that we have in place to help protect ourselves. So it's very important to be vigilant and do your part to protect your organization. And this should definitely be shared with your employees because this is something very important. Your bank that you're utilizing probably has a combination of controls in place to help protect you as well. So even your vendors might have controls in place to help protect you. Your bank, though, has a duty to properly educate you about programs that they have in place to safeguard you from unauthorized transactions. And things that they may be doing to assist you include, but certainly not limited to, offering positive pay, maybe performing callbacks regarding certain high-risk transactions, device authentication controls, multi-person approval processes, and batch limits to help protect you against fraudulent transactions. Some of these examples include multi-factor authentication, which is through tokens, text, one-time pins to text, phone calls, etc. User alerts for when users are added or removed from an online account. Device authentication methods or restrictions such as IP address whitelists or location restrictions. Enhanced controls for high-risk transactions such as dual approval, out-of-band verification through phone calls, text messaging, emails, etc. Batch limits, like I just said before. The sky's the limit on those kind of controls that can be put in place. And then another thing is user training, which is what we're doing today. Obviously, we want to make sure we're educating our customers as well. So, but you also have some responsibility to educate your own users. So I would definitely take the time to explain some of those things to them. So what should you do to protect yourself? I would partner with your bank to prevent unauthorized transactions. Talk to your banker about the types of controls that I mentioned in the previous slide. Ask them about positive pay or other services offered, such as callbacks, device authentication, multi-person approval processes, and batch limits that would help protect you from fraud. If you're not aware of what they're offering on their end to protect you, it's time that you reach out and talk to them and ask about it. So without proper security, there's no way that you can ensure that you will remain protected while performing your business functions. Another control to implement would be activity controls. And this is something that you should have access to in order to configure through your online banking account. This would alert you of any suspicious activity, whether it be a transaction over a certain dollar limit or a dollar amount, an approved batch that occurred, you name it. I know my bank has multiple things. It could be when my balance falls below a certain dollar amount, whatever it may be. Also, make sure that you understand what your responsibilities are as it relates to your bank's agreement. You may be required to apply certain safeguards within your organization to ensure that you remain fully protected. So you definitely want to make sure that you're doing your part as well. So we talked a lot about things that could be potentially detrimental to any business. Now let's talk about some of the things that you can do to help stay secure. We've had a lot of changes to our work environments over the last few years. Our existing IT management concerns may have grown as we added more complexity with new software and employees working from home. This has resulted in a rise in the implications surrounding information security and has shown us that we need to make sure our organizations are as secure as they can be. Knowing what we know now about the fact that breaches are going to happen, the breach costs are not a one-time cost, and studies have found that most organizations were affected multiple years after an initial breach. Look at the one for, now I forget, Twitter, that started in 2021, and as of 2023, January, it's still occurring, and things are still coming up related to that breach years later. Implementing mitigating safeguards result in lower overall breach costs, so that's a good thing. Organizations that identified a breach more quickly than others experience significantly reduced costs, lower costs. Therefore, resources you devote now to increase preventative and detective and response controls can minimize the short-term and long-term financial impact on your organization. In addition, many cybersecurity controls can increase the efficiency and effectiveness of existing processes. For example, a centralized monitoring tool may allow your IT staff to more effectively monitor the patch and anti-malware management processes. So while there is an upfront cost to implement that tool, your staff will have added time savings that will allow them to devote their expertise to other functional, critical functions such as incident identification. So we want to make sure that we are, reducing those manual processes and implementing some additional automated controls, just so that we can add the manual stuff can be added to these detection processes and other incident identification controls. When it comes to security, there are several concerns. We're just going to scratch the surface on a few of these here, because I do want to go over in detail how a remote workforce can affect the traditional security you have in place. So we've seen numerous issues from remote access setups with limited controls due to the speedy implementation process that we all had to adhere to because of COVID happening so fast. At this point in time, though, we should have all worked through those kinks and should have some more robust security in place at this point. Another thing that I wanted to bring up is about third-party relationships. They are still a huge concern, along with identifying what the organization's responsibilities are and ensuring that our end users accept the processes in place that we have established. We're going to break these down a little bit further, though, in the next couple of slides. In an ideal world, there are a lot of questions you would want to pose to a potential third party or cloud vendor. Nowadays, we don't necessarily want to host anything in-house. I know most of our clients who were in-house organizations, they have outsourced almost everything. A vendor could be someone, though, who provides outsourced IT support for you, like a managed service provider. It could also be just an accounting platform or a secure file transfer service or other supporting products that you need for everyday purposes. There are certain questions that you would want to consider. from who the vendors could be, because we have third-party service providers, also have sub-service providers of their own that they're dealing with, whether they do or do not have remote workforce in place, to what type of risk assessments or third-party audits they have completed. Not only that, but in regard to information security, ask about how they keep networks and devices up to date. If they're going to be providing those services to you, you'll want to know how they plan to accomplish that. There will most likely be some component of cloud usage in place, which again is why it's important to ensure they're reviewing their vendors accordingly. And then lastly, vendor documentation can be helpful in determining how reliable the vendor is going to be. Looking at financial condition, business continuity planning, insurance coverage, and incident response can be key areas that you'll want a potential vendor to be fluent in. So before engaging in a new vendor relationship, you need to ensure that they are maintaining proper security controls. You also need to ensure that their contracts include applicable language, especially confidentiality, breach notification, and even termination details, such as how will you gain access to your data if the relationship is terminated. Another thing that you could do is discuss with other organizations that are using the same service. Please note that this is not a fail-safe way to proceed, though, that this is an additional method and should never be a single method in verifying a new vendor relationship. When talking to these organizations, though, you can figure out controls like hardening of the system, proper implementation processes. Maybe they've experienced something and have suggestions on a better way to process it. Also, they can inform you of any mistakes that they might have made that you could learn from. With your existing vendors, an ongoing review process is extremely important to ensure they are maintaining your data security. You never want to sign that contract and walk away from it. So some areas to consider for the ongoing review of your critical vendor relationships includes, but definitely is not limited to, reviewing security audit reports. This could be SOC reports, vulnerability testing, penetration testing, etc. Business continuity, disaster recovery testing and backup testing, financial statement reviews, review of existing contracts for appropriate language related to, again, breach notification, confidentiality, information security, and even, again, terms and conditions of the contract. And let's not forget about the vendor's vendor oversight processes. They should have some type of vendor management process in place themselves for all those subservice providers that they are utilizing. Now that we talked about our vendors, let's talk about your responsibilities. This could be in-house supported solutions or vendor managed solutions, either way. But when it comes to the outsourced vendor relationships, we cannot just wash our hands of any responsibility when it comes to those outsourced services. We have a responsibility to oversee what the vendor is doing for us. I know we all want to put 100% trust in the vendor and just walk away, but that's not the reality of how things go. When we outsource services such as patch management, malware management, or even backup processes, we still have some roles to play in the process. We must request reports from our vendors to ensure that there are no issues to discuss and to ensure that the services that are being performed as intended. So for example, let's take patch management. The vendor might choose not to apply a patch for some reason. We have seen in several instances where a vendor has not updated the firmware on a network device because they feel it's really low risk update for them. Well, you might not feel the same way. You may decide that the update must be applied to ensure that your environment is fully protected. We've also seen instances where obsolete applications are installed and the vendor did not even notice, or perhaps just did not notify you. If this is the case in your organization, you would need to request that the obsolete applications are removed as soon as possible. What I mean by obsolete means they're no longer supported and no longer being provided with security patches. That's a big problem. Another thing that we've noticed before is where backups have failed for weeks at a time and the organization was not made aware of it. This would be something that you would want to discuss immediately with your vendor to ensure that they are correcting whatever the issue is as soon as possible, to ensure that your backups are being performed. So what should you be doing to protect yourself? Something that we should be doing to protect our environment is following a user account provisioning and access control process. Access should be granted on a need-to-know basis. So we do not want to have all users with the same level of access, as not everyone is performing the same duties. For some examples of restrictions that are likely in place within your organization would be administrative access limited to those who need to have administrative access. You would never want to set everyone up as an admin. So what happens when you have, another example, what happens if you have someone who has been transferred to a new role? In that instance, you need to ensure that all previous access is evaluated to determine what changes are necessary as a result in this change in job function. Remember, we always want to ensure that we are granting access on a need-to-know basis. Principle of least privilege. And then we also have to think about termination of staff members. All accounts associated with a terminated user should be disabled or deleted upon notification of termination. We would never want to leave access turned on for someone who's no longer with the organization. There are some extenuating circumstances, but those would be situations where you would get approval to possibly leave active. And if you did leave it active, you need to change the password, possibly because of the need to, you're using it possibly maybe to monitor something on the account or whatever. Another one that a lot of people don't think about, what happens when you have an employee who's going to be out on extended leave? Maybe this is someone on maternity leave. These accounts should be disabled while the user's out, as they do not need access while they're on leave. Upon their return, the account can be re-enabled. I'm not talking about deleting them while they're gone, just disable and then enable when they come back. We also need to ensure that we have review processes for those vendor, contractor, and auditor accounts. Those are only needed when services are being rendered, which is not on a daily basis. So when they are not in use, make sure that you're disabling them. And for the vendor the vendors who have access around the clock, maybe they do need 24/7 access. We should have a process in place to ensure that the users are still necessary. Just note that these are just some examples, obviously. User access is a major factor in every organization's security control environment, so we need to pay close attention there. Password security is one of the most important areas, as we all use passwords to access every system we use on a daily basis. Password complexity can be defined as a combination of numbers, letters, and special characters or symbols. Some additional key pointers here are that we want to ensure that we avoid the use of common words in our passwords. It's always best to use a random passphrase. We need to change them often, especially when we know if our passwords have been compromised. If you know one password's been compromised, you may as well go ahead and change them all, just to be on the safe side. We also want to ensure that we maintain a minimum number of characters in our passwords. This is controlled by your IT department typically, and each application has its own configuration that are in line with the organization's standards. All configurations that are not in line with the organization's minimum standards should be documented and approved. And I'm sure you see here the length. Our recommendation at this point in time is a minimum of 12. Microsoft has had changes to theirs, which is now 14. And this is an ever-changing process, and I'm going to explain why with this little graphic on the next slide. Just a little insight into how long it typically takes to crack passwords depending on the length and complexity. So the more characters you add to your password, the longer it takes for the bad guys to crack it. Your organization has likely evaluated and determined the level of risk that they are comfortable with as it relates to minimum password standards. The typical standard that we are seeing is a minimum of 8 characters in most of our organizations. Hence why we've kind of made the recommendation to shift that to 12. But to help mitigate the risks further, most organizations have also implemented complexity, which includes a combination of letters, numbers, and special characters. Looking here, though, according to Hive Systems, the time it would take a hacker to crack an 8-character password with this type of complexity in place would be 39 minutes. 39 minutes, that's it. That's not a very long time. Some additional password security controls that most organizations have implemented are the requirement of the passwords to be changed every 90 days. Another control that most organizations are implementing is limiting the reuse of previous passwords. An example of this is when someone changes their password, they're not allowed to use one of the last 20 passwords or so used previously for when they changed password. As with any other control, we are at the mercy of our vendors. So even though these control standards are implemented, there are systems that do not allow for these requirements. So when that happens, we need to ensure that we implement manual controls to comply with the standards documented in our own policies. And like I said earlier, the exception should be definitely documented and improved. Here are some additional helpful tips when thinking about password management. Use unique passwords across different applications. Try not to use the same one for every application that you're accessing. Remember, if one gets compromised and you use the same one to access all of your systems, you have essentially allowed the bad guy access to all of your systems. Another big one is do not commingle business and personal passwords. Again, this is important because if your personal information were to have been compromised in an attack, such as Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, etc., which you likely have already become a victim of, you would not want that information to be the same as your business information. That just means that when your credentials are sold on the black market or the dark web, which is happening as we speak, because it happens all the time, you are exposing your organization to unnecessary potential compromise as well. Since I mentioned to not reuse passwords on multiple systems, that means we have a lot of passwords to remember. So the use of a password management tool is probably a good recommendation to implement, because that would be a system that you could actually store those passwords in, and they would be encrypted, not easily hacked. Definitely something I would look into. Another control, account should lock out after 3 to 5 invalid attempts and should require an admin to unlock, not these locked out after 3 attempts and only locked for 1 to 5 minutes. Obviously, that allows a fraudster to have numerous attempts in a day's time frame. Inactivity timeouts should be enabled to automatically log a user out of a system after a set period of inactive time, which is typically 15 minutes as a recommendation. And then for externally accessible systems, biometrics or multi-factor authentication should be utilized to gain access. Another thing to consider for internally accessible systems, the ones that have like IP restrictions or you can't access it from outside, multi-factor should also be considered for that when it's high risk access, such as administrative access, or maybe someone has fund transfer capability or something of that nature. Those should have that multi-factor layer included as well. Essentially, as you can see though, we want to ensure that we have layers of security controls in place. The more layers we have, the harder it is for the bad guys to gain access. And since I brought up multi-factor authentication, commonly referred to as MFA, I want to go a little deeper into that, since this is a very important control for you to understand. So we typically have baseline sets of parameters that we recommend as a best practice. And we get arguments a lot of the time that guidance has come out stating we don't need to have passwords expire. What those arguments fail to realize, though, is the fact that guidance recognizes the layers of controls, such as some of the controls that I noted in the last slide: account lockout, inactivity timeouts, changing of passwords, you name it. So when we access cloud applications for email, maybe Amazon Web Services, remote access systems, we're accessing them from outside of our network in most cases. When that happens, we need to ensure that we have the extra layer of control that requires us to provide something we have. The definition of MFA is something you know, your username and your password combination, something you have, a security token or a PIN or something of that nature, and something you are, biometric, like a fingerprint or face recognition type situation. MFA would require a combination of these controls. Another control that you could implement that is not really MFA, but restricts the applications from being accessible from outside of your network, is to implement IP address restrictions. This would block access to a system from any other IP address except for the organization's network. Another way to enhance this control would be to also include time of day restrictions. And this is typically enabled on the network for most organizations. They only allow users maybe to log in between the hours of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. or 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. Unless their job requires them to have 24/7 access, such as an IT support member. Please keep in mind, though, that MFA is not always a foolproof method. Back in 2019, specifically, I say this all the time, the FBI had warned about some attacks that bypassed the MFA controls in place. They had noted several incidents where MFA had been bypassed, whether through weaknesses identified in the multi-factor authentication platform or through SIM swapping. And also in 2021, I'm just going to give you a couple of examples of MFA bypassing that happened and led to a breach. In 2021, SolarWinds was attacked through bypassing multi-factor authentication. In 2022, a Cisco employee was tricked into accepting an MFA request, which allowed a bad guy to gain access. A lot of times that's called, I cannot remember what it's called. I'll ignore that for now. It's happening so across the board though, so you can't just rely on MFA as a fail-safe method. It's definitely something that we want to consider. You need the layers of control. Again, so that's the moral of the story. Layered controls are the way to go. We never want to rely on just one single control to protect our environment. Let's talk a little bit about email. We need to be careful what we open in email. Emails can easily be spoofed or hacked, just like the email I noted earlier that was sent to HR regarding an employee's payroll. That is an instance of what could have been a spoofed email. We have seen instances of hacked emails where the bad guys created an auto forward of all emails to an outside fraudulent email account. We need to ensure, like I said earlier, that auto forwarding is disabled, or at a minimum, we need to implement controls to detect auto forwarding rules when they are created. We need to be able to monitor them. Not all solutions are encrypted. That's another problem. Office 365 by design alone is not encrypted, except for internal communications. If sending something sensitive outside of the organization's domain, you must use an encrypted email solution, also referred to as secure email. Now, if you're using a outlook.com email, that is not going to be secured internal communications because that's not on your specific domain. Webmail should also be restricted, and what this means is externally accessible email access. If externally access is deemed necessary, appropriate multi-factor authentication controls should be implemented. You should never use unapproved email solutions to communicate with customers or employees, and always use caution when receiving requests for any kind of sensitive information. And lastly, we should have some kind of control in place, if at all possible, to either strip links within emails that appear to be fraudulent, or by sandboxing emails that contain links until they can be validated by your IT department or by the system. I'm sure you all know what a Wi-Fi network is. We have them everywhere. They're in our houses, our airports, coffee shops, everywhere. What we need to know about Wi-Fi networks is pretty simple though. For your Wi-Fi at home, you should ensure that it's properly secured. You want to make sure that you have enabled strong access controls using WPA2 encryption. All that means is pretty much by you going in and setting up passwords to access your Wi-Fi, that essentially, unless you don't have a good Wi-Fi system, essentially that is creating the encryption. For those of you who are working from home, make sure that you have a your Wi-Fi is divided into work traffic and personal traffic. You don't want your smart TVs sitting on top of your work network. This usually can be configured through a guest network and a main network, and that's usually, it can be separated in the device itself. Typically, this can be done by logging into the console and creating that guest network, like I said. So make sure that all devices remain updated with security patches. These are also mini little computers that need to have updates made to them. So we never just want to set them up and forget about them. We need to make sure that we're applying our updates. An important thing for everyone to know, whether you're using Wi-Fi for work or personal use, be careful when you connect to public Wi-Fi networks. They are not always properly secured. So if you are going to connect to one, never do so on your company-owned equipment. And if connected on a personal device, never conduct sensitive business like checking your banking account information or conducting any financial activities. So there could be a bad guy watching on the unsecured network. One way to help protect your information when using the internet, not just when using Wi-Fi networks, is to always use the secured version of the sites, the HTTPS version, as this will help to ensure that your data is protected. When conducting business remotely, whether on Wi-Fi or regular network connection, always use your organization's VPN if you have one. This helps to secure that traffic. Another thing that you can consider the use of is a mobile hotspot. And what this is you can do it on your cell phone if you have unlimited data plan. I mean, you can also do it without an unlimited data plan, but you could run up your bill. Or maybe a company-owned hotspot. This can also be utilized to create a secure connection. So just note that these should be configured securely as well. You don't want to leave those wide open. You want to make sure you have proper passwords set and everything else just like you would on a normal Wi-Fi network. Malware protection is also very important. So there are many different forms of malware protection in the industry, but your organization should have a centrally managed solution in place. Through a centrally managed solution, updates to the system get pushed to all devices, including workstations, laptops, and servers, when updates are made available. The console should also be monitored on a regular basis by your IT staff to ensure that updates are being applied as intended. Full system scans or on-access scans should be configured to run regularly to check your systems for any malicious software that might have been installed. And what you can do to help in this process is to ensure that you leave your machines turned on so that the anti-malware solution can apply the updates to your machine timely. When we shut our systems down at the end of each day, this prevents the patch management, anti-malware management, and any even local system backups from running on your system. For patch management, again, there are many different solutions in circulation in the industry, but your organization likely has a centrally managed solution in place. Manual patching is not sufficient in our environments as there is no way to really manage the process fully to ensure that our systems are fully protected. Patching of systems and third-party applications can be a cumbersome process, so we need to ensure that, just like for the malware updates, your machines need to be turned on in order to obtain the patches necessary to stay up to date. Now let's talk about managing all of the devices in our organization. This process, takes place, it involves the utilization of the patches and anti-malware updates that we just talked about. Another thing to consider though is reconciliation. It has to take place to ensure that all the devices in use are present in the centrally managed systems. This is done to ensure that all devices are receiving the updates necessary. Also, this is necessary to ensure that issues identified can be remediated timely. In addition to the patch and anti-malware management that is taking place, there are also additional controls that have likely been implemented to prevent unnecessary vulnerabilities. This includes things like limiting user access rights on the local systems. The local users do not need to have administrative access. There is no reason for them to have administrative access to those computers. We want to ensure that unapproved applications do not get installed, which the restriction on administrative access helps to prevent this from happening. These applications, although they seem harmless, they introduce additional management processes related to keeping them updated. So that is why restrictions are necessary. With some systems having the need to be remote, there can be added complications. So keep this in mind and be mindful of any requests for updates on your work devices. It would be best to question if they're legitimate and get with IT to determine if your machine is missing a patch. We have seen some fake update requests before, and that's why it's very important to ask the questions. And then another big thing is circumventing any of these controls can create issues on the device or make you more susceptible to malware. So make sure that you're not tampering with or trying to bypass the controls that have been set by your IT department. They are there to protect you and your organization. When surfing the web, make sure that you're being cautious. We want to avoid any questionable websites. For example, when you are performing a Google search, make sure that you're not clicking on the ads that are labeled as an ad. Those are sometimes not valid sites. Be very cautious when downloading content or applications. Thankfully, those restrictions I just spoke about will help to prevent some of this from happening, like those admin restrictions. Make sure that your browser remains current. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, your IT department is likely ensuring that your device remains up to date. But think of when you are using your own computer, the web browsers are applications as well and need to have appropriate security updates applied. Inspect URLs before you click. Make sure that they are in fact the site you intended to visit. Malvertising is a malicious cyber tactic that attempts to distribute malware through online advertisements. This is why we add restrictions to the type of sites you can access online while on the organization's network. Many sites such as Facebook, YouTube, and many others are famous for having ads play while you're on their site. And this exposes the organization to unnecessary potential for malware to be installed through one of these advertising campaigns that are placed on these sites to do harm. Sadly, you will not even see it happening in most cases. You just visit the site, and the second the ad starts playing, malware starts to install in the background. Social networking is another risk posed to your organization. For example, as we discussed earlier, the information that we post online can be used against us in future attacks, such as phishing and vishing. Phishing is a voice phishing attack via phone call. The bad guys will use the information that we post online to share with our friends and family to attack us in the future. And this is done through impersonation. A prime example when someone connects or contacts the organization to gain access to something on their account. We want to ensure that we properly verify the person's identity before we release any information to them. Depending on the services that you are providing, or even when it comes to processing payroll for your employees, when you ask about an individual's mother's maiden name, the likelihood that they are linked on Facebook and the mom has her maiden name displayed is very high. So that is not a good form of verification. This is a prime example of why it's important to use out-of-wallet questions when verifying a customer's identity. They can also use the information that we post online to steal our identity. Pretexting is a method where the bad guys use the information we post online to then pretend to be from your organization, your college, or even our cell service provider to attempt to trick us into providing additional information via text. Just remember that even when you think it is, your data is not always private, and just think of the amount of information that we share with each other online through these social media platforms. Now let's talk a little bit about mobile devices. We all utilize a mobile device for our daily tasks, whether that be phone calls, texting, emails, or even playing online. These devices are just a microcomputer or a mini computer and are just as important when it comes to maintaining proper security. These devices are just as susceptible to getting malware as any other computer that we use in our daily lives. If your organization allows the use of mobile devices to access company resources such as email, you should have a mobile device acceptable use policy in place. When using mobile devices, you should ensure that you have good security controls applied to these devices. For example, these devices should have some form of access restrictions, such as an access PIN or password or even biometrics to gain access. Updates should be applied to these devices as they are released by the vendor, Apple, Android, etc. This will ensure that your device remains protected. These devices should also be encrypted, as company data is likely stored in some form or fashion on them. If you're using an Android device, you might have to install anti-malware software, as they do not all have built-in protection. Hopefully your organization has the ability to remote wipe your device in the event that the device is lost or stolen. And another set of controls that your organization may have applied are data loss prevention controls, which prevents your organization's data that is on your device from being accessed or stored outside of the email application. A good example of this would be not allowing emails or attachments to sync to iCloud or to your local computer. When it comes to mobile devices, data storage is definitely something that we need to get a handle on. Like I said in the previous slide, the use of iCloud might be disabled through your organization's mobile device management system. But let's discuss why this is important. It's very easy to transfer data between local applications and iCloud. For example, if you're using your email to open attachments, the file may open in iBooks, which then saves the file to the device. Those files that are stored in iBooks can easily be transferred to iCloud for backup storage. Therefore, your company data could potentially be stored in iCloud, which definitely presents a bigger issue of where else could your data be stored. Another thing to note in regard to data on devices, you need to make sure to let IT know if you are getting rid of a current device, whether that means by upgrading to a new device, passing your old one down to another person, you name it. Proper procedures to remove company data on the device need to be followed. And also, if you need to bring your phone in for repair, you need to coordinate this with IT before you bring the device in, as it might be necessary to wipe the company data off the device before the phone is brought in for service. You might not be as familiar with this topic, but I will explain a little more. Internet of Things devices can come in many shapes and sizes. You'd probably be surprised at how many devices now connect to the internet. There can be a lot of stuff out there on your network, and it's important to know what those devices are. It is also even more important, since a lot of us are operating from home environments. Some controls to consider include, but are not limited to, changing the administrative passwords whenever employees who had access to the passwords leave your organization. Also enabling strong passwords, lockout settings, and multi-factor authentication for access to these devices. Evaluating data and analytics, sharing privacy features and location sharing settings. Apply applicable patches and updates timely. If you set automatic updates, you should have a process to check the status of those updates. You definitely want to disable any unnecessary features. Connect the device to a guest network that is segmented from your data network, or isolate less secure risky devices via VLANs or DMZs. And some examples of Internet of Things devices that you might have in your organization or possibly your home office include, but are definitely not limited to, smart TVs, the Amazon Echo Dots, maybe you have smart thermostats, coffee makers that might be smart coffee makers, card systems, multifunction printers, alarm systems, DVRs, cameras. There's so many out there. And one other area of concern with some of the Internet of Things devices is that they have the ability to listen to conversations. An example of this would be the Amazon Echo. So let's not forget about online collaboration. This has become the norm for almost all organizations through Microsoft Teams, Zoom, GoToMeeting, and WebEx. Our work environments have drastically changed because of COVID, but it has also brought on some added benefits to each of our organizations by allowing us the ability to communicate through the use of video conferencing and other remote tools. But don't forget that these systems have their issues as well. We do not want to ignore the fact that recording of videos tends to save the recordings in the cloud environment of the service provider. This, for this, think about the things that you are discussing on these meetings that might be confidential, and make sure you do your due diligence to ensure that your data is properly secured. With the new ways we need to work, I imagine you have had drastic increase in remote access users. So we need to think about those remote access controls to ensure that our data and systems remain protected, even when our employees are not physically connected to our network. These are what we consider more traditional methods for gaining access to the network resources. You may have already had some of these in place, like VPNs for employees who may travel or work in the field. You may even have some of these locked down and restricted. Some things to ask yourself would be, were there any added security implications by increasing the use of remote access tools? Did you allow users to utilize personally owned devices to remote in? How does this affect the strategic planning of your organization? Is it necessary to buy desktop computers anymore? Can we change the way we allow personal devices to interface with our resources? Whatever you keep in place, you want to make sure it's secured appropriately. Using outdated remote access methods can open you up to heightened security issues. Shadow IT is also a term that you might not be familiar with. So shadow IT is defined as being applications and infrastructure, or devices, that are managed and utilized without the knowledge of the enterprise IT's department, or IT department. Could be utilized on internal corporate networks, maybe mobile devices, or even personal home computers. It's important to have a discussion on how shadow IT can be monitored and controlled. Some questions to ask yourself: how do you authorize the use of them? Do you have a method available to employees? How do you prevent the use of unauthorized cloud services? A lot of what's behind shadow IT are employees trying to do their jobs more efficiently. Have you set them up to have success and efficiency, or will internal processes and procedures hinder their effectiveness and push them maybe to use shadow IT services? An example would be a sales team. They shouldn't be able to transition to Salesforce or something without input from IT or IS. This all comes back to the vendor review process. And if all vendors and contracts have to follow the same review process, this is going to be much less of a risk because IT will be involved in the process along with IS. Training end users is the most important thing to do on our end. For our end users to ensure that they understand the implications behind threats that could affect your organization, which is why we're here today. We're training. One of the best things that you can do is take the information back to your own employees, which can be accomplished through IS training. In a properly secured, hardened environment, employees are the weakest link. You can ask any of our clients that we've been visiting for the past 20 plus years. They know for a fact that how important training is for their employees. A lot of times incidents occur because of an employee doing the wrong thing, not intentionally, just by accident, most cases. For example, clicking the link within a phishing email. So some key takeaways for today. These new threats may not have been on our radar a year or so ago. Maybe they have. Normally, we have time to create risk assessments and review vendors to determine who has the best security and meets our organization's needs the best. The loss of reputation can be significant cost to any organization. If you have a cyber issue that results in a breach of sensitive client or employee information or a loss of funds, your clients may lose trust in your organization. And those you work with may turn to organizations that they feel can better protect their information. The loss of future revenue streams can have a significant impact on an organization's ability to continue. Ensure that you have appropriate vendor management practices in place. Implementation or review of your security controls can ensure you are securing data and access appropriately. It really doesn't have to be expensive with the proper mindset. And that's everything we have for today. For any questions that you may have after the fact, since I know this is a recorded session, go ahead and reach out to me directly. My contact information is here. Email is probably the most likely chance you're going to get a quick response. You can definitely call, leave me a message, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. So thank you guys so much for today.